The hostess at the front door of Ember and Oak did not recognize me at first. That was entirely intentional. I had pulled my hair back sharply, traded my usual soft blazer for a structured charcoal suit, and kept my expression completely neutral as I stepped through the heavy cedar doors of the restaurant my money had built from an empty shell of a building into what was now being described on food blogs as Nashville's most anticipated debut of the year. The space looked exactly the way I had imagined it when I first wrote the check. Warm Edison bulbs strung between exposed wooden beams, locally sourced brick walls lined with framed prints of Tennessee farmland. The custom marble bar I had specifically approved white with gray veining, imported from a quarry in Georgia, gleamed under the low golden light. Every single design choice in this room had been filtered through my taste, funded by my inheritance, and signed off on by my name. The only thing that had not included me was the invitation to tonight's event. I had found out about the grand opening the same way the general public had, through Instagram. My husband had posted a reel 4 days ago. He was standing behind the marble bar I had paid for, wearing a tailored burgundy chef's coat, grinning at the camera while a soft acoustic version of a country song played underneath his voice. "Tonight is the night," he had said, turning slowly to show off the dining room. Ember and Oak officially opens its doors this Saturday. We could not have done this without the incredible support of our investors and our close family. He had tagged the restaurant's account, tagged the food critic from the Nashville scene who had already run a glowing preview piece, and tagged approximately 14 local influencers who were now scattered throughout the dining room holding champagne flutes and taking photographs of the charcuterie boards. He had not tagged me. He had not called me. He had not texted me. He had simply collected the $480,000 I had transferred from my grandmother's trust fund into his business account over the course of 14 months and opened a restaurant without me. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking a slow, measured breath and letting my eyes adjust to the warm light. The restaurant was full. There were at least 70 people pressed into the dining room: local food journalists, hospitality industry contacts, and the 2 venture partners from a regional restaurant group that my husband had been aggressively courting for a second location deal. I recognized all of them. I had personally attended 3 of the pitch meetings where my husband had charmed those investors over dinners that I had quietly subsidized. My husband was standing at the far end of the room, near the open kitchen pass-through, laughing loudly with a cluster of guests. He was in his element, broad shoulders relaxed, hands gesturing expressively, the effortless charisma that had made me fall in love with him in the first place, working the room like a well-rehearsed performance. Standing close beside him, her hand resting on his forearm with the casual familiarity of someone who had been doing it for a very long time, was a woman I recognized immediately. Her name was Amber. She was 23 years old, worked as a front-of-house manager at a bar 2 neighborhoods over, and had been sleeping with my husband for at least 8 months. I had known about her for 6 of those months. I had simply chosen to say nothing until I was ready. I was ready now. My attorney, Sandra, stepped through the door behind me. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with sharp gray eyes and a reputation in Nashville's legal community for being the kind of lawyer that opposing counsel quietly dreaded. Behind her came 2 men I did not know personally, but had hired through Sandra's firm, both licensed private process servers, wearing plain dark jackets that made them look like any other guests at a restaurant opening. I walked across the dining room without rushing. The room was loud enough that my entrance did not immediately draw attention, which was exactly what I needed. I wanted to be close before my husband saw me. I wanted to watch his face when the distance between us collapsed. I was 6 feet away when he finally looked up. The laugh died on his face so completely and so suddenly that the man standing next to him visibly noticed the change and turned to follow my husband's eyeline. My husband's jaw tightened. The color shifted in his neck the way it always did when he was caught off guard and furious about it simultaneously. His hand instinctively moved away from Amber's touch, a reflexive, guilty retraction that she clearly registered because her own expression hardened immediately. "What are you doing here?" he said. His voice was low and controlled, the words pushed out through clenched teeth, with the practiced restraint of someone who was very aware of the audience surrounding him. I did not answer right away. I let the silence between us expand just long enough for the nearest guests to pick up on the tension. Two of the local influencers were already angling their phones in our direction, with the practiced discretion of people who had been paid to document the evening. I looked around the room slowly, taking in the bar and the beams and the brick walls, and then I looked back at my husband with an expression I had practiced being very calm about. "I am here to attend the opening of Ember and Oak," I said. "I am a primary stakeholder in this establishment. I thought it would be appropriate to be present." His jaw tightened further. "I told you this was a private event for close collaborators and family," he said, still keeping his voice low. "You are making a scene. You need to leave right now before you embarrass yourself." There it was. The same framing he had used for months whenever I raised a concern that my feelings were the problem, that my presence was the disruption, that the most dignified thing I could possibly do was quietly absent myself so that his life could run more smoothly. I had been absent long enough. I nodded once at Sandra. She stepped forward and gave a small hand signal to one of the process servers. The man reached inside his jacket and produced a sealed legal envelope. He crossed the room in 4 even strides and placed the envelope directly in my husband's hand. "Marcus," Sandra said, her voice carrying the pleasant neutrality of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had become entirely routine. "You are being served with a formal notice of legal action on behalf of my client, the majority shareholder of Ember Oak LLC. Please review the documents at your earliest convenience." Marcus stared at the envelope. He did not open it. The room around us had gone noticeably quieter, the particular quality of silence that happens when a crowd senses that something real is occurring in their presence. "What is this?" Marcus said. His voice had climbed slightly, losing some of its controlled register. The room was very quiet now. I could hear the soft ambient playlist still playing through the speakers overhead. Something acoustic and unhurried that had been curated to feel like a welcoming southern evening. It felt almost absurd against the conversation happening in the center of it. "That envelope contains the formal records of Ember Oak LLC as registered with the Tennessee Secretary of State's office," I said. "Specifically, it contains the operating agreement you signed 14 months ago when the LLC was formed. I would draw your attention to Section 4 of that agreement, which outlines the equity distribution among founding members. I hold 51% of this company, Marcus. I am the majority owner of this restaurant. I have been since the day you asked me to fund it." He blinked. "That's not," he started, then stopped. "That's a formality. That was just for the bank financing. I run this restaurant. I built this." "You spent my money building it," I said. "That is a meaningful distinction." Amber moved a half-step backward, her expression recalibrating rapidly. She was young, but she was not unintelligent, and the math was clearly resolving itself in real time behind her eyes. Marcus straightened his posture, pulling his shoulders back in the way he always did when he decided to perform confidence he did not actually feel. He looked around at the room full of guests and journalists and influencers and took a visible breath. He had charmed rooms before. He was going to try to charm this one. He held up a hand and smiled, the warm public smile that had made food critics write paragraphs about his approachability. "I apologize for the disruption, everyone," he said, projecting his voice with practiced ease across the dining room. "My wife and I have a difference of opinion about some business paperwork, which we will absolutely resolve privately. Tonight is about celebrating the food, the space, and this incredible community." He gestured toward the kitchen. "Chef Diego is plating the tasting menu right now. Please, let's enjoy the evening." A few guests smiled uncertainly and turned back to their conversations. The two venture partners near the window exchanged a quick, measured look. Investors always noticed when a founder's domestic situation collided with his business structure. It was the kind of flag that made due diligence more complicated. I waited for the murmurs to settle. I let Marcus believe for exactly 10 seconds that he had successfully redirected the room. Then I spoke. "Marcus," I said, loud enough to carry, "before your chef sends out a single plate tonight, there is one more document you should read." Sandra opened her leather portfolio and produced a second packet, this one bound with a blue cover sheet. She handed it to the second process server, who carried it across the room and set it on the marble bar directly in front of my husband. "That is the commercial lease agreement for this property," I said. 1,400 square feet of premium real estate on Germantown's primary dining corridor, leased under the name of a commercial property holding company called Meridian South Properties. I paused just long enough for the name to register. Meridian South is a wholly owned subsidiary of the firm where I work. I manage this property portfolio. You signed a lease with my company, Marcus. I have been your landlord since the day you moved in. The room went completely still. Marcus's hand came down flat on the marble bar. "That is not possible," he said, and for the first time his voice had lost all its performance. It was just a man in a burgundy chef's coat sounding genuinely afraid. I reviewed that lease with an attorney. The landlord was a corporate entity. There was no "you were never named" in those documents. I was the managing agent, I said. My name is at the bottom of page 11. You were so focused on getting the keys that you never read the full document. He grabbed the blue packet off the bar and started flipping pages with hands that were not entirely steady. I watched him find page 11. I watched his eyes move across the signature block. I watched his face go the specific pale color of a person whose entire strategic framework has just been revealed as a fiction. His mother, Diane, had been standing near the far wall with a glass of wine, wearing the expression she always wore at events she considered her social due. Diane had spent the last year telling her book club and her church circle and anyone else who would listen that her son was opening the finest restaurant in Nashville. She had told people that the funding had come from a combination of his savings and a small business loan. She had told people specifically that I had not been involved in any meaningful capacity beyond being supportive. I had heard this secondhand through a mutual friend and had said nothing, filed it away, and waited. Diane set her wine glass down and began walking toward us, with the measured authority of a woman who believed she could resolve any situation through sheer force of social confidence. "Marcus," she said in a low voice when she reached us, "stop engaging. Let your attorney handle this." His attorney was not present. I had known his attorney was not present because Sandra had called her counterpart's office yesterday and confirmed that Marcus had neglected to mention to his own legal counsel that his estranged wife might be attending the opening. Diane turned to me. Her expression was controlled and cool, the particular expression she had perfected over 20 years of treating me like a guest at a party I had not quite been invited to. "You have made your point," she said quietly. "This is his night. Whatever grievances you have can be handled through proper channels without humiliating him publicly." I looked at her steadily. "I have filed through proper channels," I said. "The proper channel sent me here tonight." Diane's composure slipped just slightly. She looked from me to Sandra to the documents in Marcus's hands and began performing a rapid internal calculation that was visible in the way her expression shifted through several phases before landing somewhere between alarm and denial. Sandra stepped forward with the measured efficiency she brought to every difficult moment. She addressed the room rather than any individual. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sandra Whitfield. I am the legal representative for the majority owner and primary leaseholder of this property. I want to be transparent with everyone present tonight. Effective as of this evening, Ember Oak LLC is subject to a civil injunction filed in Davidson County, citing misappropriation of investor funds, material breach of partnership agreement, and fraudulent allocation of joint business capital for personal use. That injunction prohibits the operation of this restaurant under its current management structure, pending a full financial audit." The venture partners were no longer making eye contact with anyone in particular. They were putting on jackets. Marcus spun toward me with the full force of his frustration dropping its careful social mask. "You cannot shut down my restaurant," he said. "You cannot walk in here on opening night and destroy everything I have built. Do you understand what this does to my career?" I looked at him the way I had been practicing, looking at him for 6 months, with something that was not quite anger and not quite indifference, but was very close to the particular clarity that arrives when you have finished being afraid of someone. "You used $48,000 of our joint business capital to lease an apartment for Amber," I said. My voice was even. "I have the wire transfer records. You forged an expense report classifying it as a vendor retainer. Sandra has filed that documentation with the court. along with the records from the other 14 personal expenditures you ran through the LLC account over the last year. You did not just take my money, Marcus. You committed financial fraud against your own business entity, the one you asked me to fund. The room had gone so quiet that I could hear one of the influencers near the door inhale sharply. Amber, who had been standing at a careful distance through the last several minutes, finally spoke. Her voice came out high and strained. You used the restaurant account, she said, staring at Marcus. You told me that apartment was covered by your personal savings. Marcus turned to her with an expression that contained equal parts desperation and the particular resentment of a man who felt betrayed by the consequences of his own decisions. Not now, he said. You told me you owned this restaurant outright, she said, louder now. You told me she was just a silent backer who had already signed over her interest. That was what you said. She gestured around the room, at Sandra, at me, at the documents on the marble bar. You told me she had no legal standing left in this building. I do not know who told you that, I said, turning briefly toward her. But whoever did was not working from the current operating agreement. Amber pressed her hand to her forehead and let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something considerably less composed. She looked at my husband with an expression I recognized, not heartbreak, exactly, but the dawning comprehension of a person who has just realized that the situation they are standing in is much more complicated than the version they were given. Marcus, she said, is she really the landlord? He did not answer. The venture partners left quietly through the front door, and I let them go without comment. Their departure was its own kind of punctuation. Diane had moved to stand beside her son, her wine glass abandoned on the nearest table. The socialite ease had left her completely. She looked older, suddenly, standing in the light of a dining room that was rapidly emptying of the people whose presence had made it feel like success. She turned to Marcus with something in her expression that was not maternal comfort but raw, practical panic. The cosign, she said to him in a low voice that carried farther than she intended in the newly quiet room. Marcus, the equipment lease. The one you asked me to cosign because you said the LLC's credit history was too short for approval. Marcus closed his eyes. The commercial kitchen equipment lease that you took out in both your name and your mother's, Sandra said, producing a third document from her portfolio without any particular fanfare, also contained a personal guarantee clause. Under the terms of that lease and given the active injunction on the LLC, both signatories are now potentially liable for the remaining balance of $62,000. Diane made a sound I had never heard her make before. Marcus, she said, and his name in her mouth had become something different. What did you do? He did not answer that either. The remaining guests had begun moving toward the exit, in the way crowds do when they realize that the event they are attending has turned into something they do not want to be documented near. The food journalists had put their notebooks away. The influencers had for the first time all evening lowered their phones. The catering staff, who had been moving between the kitchen and the dining room with quiet professionalism, had stopped moving entirely. A cluster of white jackets standing near the service corridor, watching the room with the particular, expressionless attention of people whose paychecks have just become uncertain. Marcus looked at the emptying restaurant with the expression of a man watching something irreplaceable drain away. He looked at the marble bar and the Edison bulbs and the custom brick walls, and then he looked at me, and what was in his face was not anger anymore. It was the small, gutted look of a person confronting the specific consequences of choices they had told themselves would never fully arrive. You do not have to do this, he said. His voice had gone quiet. Whatever I did, whatever I got wrong, this is my career. This is everything I have worked toward. You know that. You were there for all of it. I was there for all of it, I agreed. I funded most of it. Natalie, he started. My name is not Natalie. He had a habit of using other women's names when he was under pressure. An old nervous tic I had catalogued long ago. I mean, he shook his head. He was genuinely unraveling. I know I made mistakes. I know there are things between us that need to be addressed. But shutting down the restaurant punishes everyone who works here. The kitchen staff, the front of house team, all the vendors. You are hurting real people to hurt me. It was the most sophisticated version of the argument, and I had expected it, because Marcus was smart and because it was not entirely wrong. I had thought about the staff. I had thought about them carefully. The injunction applies to the current management structure, I said, not the business itself. The employees who showed up tonight will receive their contracted pay for this event. Sandra has already coordinated with the payroll processor. Anyone who wants to reapply for their position under new management is welcome to do so. I have a meeting with the culinary director on Monday morning. He stared at me. I am not here to burn the restaurant down, I said. I am here to take it back. Sandra moved quietly to the front door and held it open. The last of the guests filtered through. The ambient playlist continued playing softly overhead, unbothered. Amber picked up her coat from the back of a bar stool. She looked at Marcus for a long moment with an expression that contained neither warmth nor sympathy, only the cool, businesslike finality of someone closing an account. "You have my number," she said. "Have your attorney contact me about the car." "The car," I said. She looked at me without flinching. "He put it in my name, but the payments came out of the business account. Sandra already flagged it in the filing." She looked back at Marcus. "I am not going down for your mistakes. I cooperated with her attorney's office last week." Marcus turned to her with an expression of raw betrayal that would have been easier to witness if it had not been so entirely earned. She walked out the front door without looking back. Diane stood at the edge of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the dining room with its perfect lighting and its empty tables and its untouched tasting menus still waiting in the kitchen. She had spent a year telling people her son had built this. Looking at her now, I thought she was finally understanding what that had actually meant. She turned to Marcus, and the expression on her face was not the one she had worn all evening, not the proud socialite, not the protective mother managing a situation. It was something stripped down and exhausted and honest in a way I had rarely seen from her. "How much of the equipment lease?" she said quietly. "What is the actual number?" He told her. She closed her eyes. "Everything I said at the beginning, Marcus," she said. "Every reservation I had about the structure, about the financing, about moving this fast, I set it aside because I believed you, because I always believed you." She opened her eyes and looked at him with the particular grief of a parent confronting the distance between the child they imagined and the one standing in front of them. "You did not just take her money. You put my name on a debt without my real understanding of the risk." "I handled the paperwork," he said. "I explained it to you. You signed it." "You told me it was a formality," she said. "You told me it would never be called." He looked away. She picked up her coat from the chair where it had been folded all evening. She did not say anything further to him. She walked to the front door, paused with her hand on the cedar frame, and looked back at the room one last time. Then she walked out into the Nashville night without looking at her son. Marcus stood in the center of the empty restaurant for a long moment. The only people remaining were Sandra, the two process servers, two members of the kitchen staff who had not yet been relieved for the evening, and me. He looked at the bar. He looked at the menu printed on craft paper that was still standing in small frames at the center of each table setting, the careful serif font listing the courses he had planned for months. He looked like a man who had not yet decided how to carry what had just happened, and I understood, in a removed and quiet way, that what was on his face was real. I had loved him once, genuinely and fully, and with the particular openness of someone who had not yet learned to read the signs. I had believed in his talent, which was genuine, and in his ambition, which was also genuine, and in his loyalty, which had turned out to be conditional in ways I had not understood until the conditions changed. I did not feel triumphant standing in the restaurant that night. I felt clear. There is a difference. Sandra placed her hand briefly on my arm and nodded toward the door. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of Ember and Oak for the first time as its legal owner, stepping onto the sidewalk where the Nashville evening was warm and smelled faintly of rain coming in from the west. 4 months later, I sat in a wood-paneled conference room in the Davidson County Courthouse wearing a dark green blazer and listening to my husband's attorney explain to the presiding judge why his client's financial obligations should be courthouse discharged through bankruptcy proceedings. Marcus sat across the wide table looking like a version of himself that had been left out in poor weather. The chef's coat was gone. He was wearing a gray suit that fit adequately. but lacked the careful tailoring of the clothes he had worn when the money was there to care about such things. He had spent the last 4 months working as a sous chef at a hotel restaurant downtown, a position that paid a fraction of what he had projected Ember and Oak would generate within its first fiscal year. His attorney was a competent man making a reasonable argument that Marcus was genuinely insolvent, that the LLC's assets had been tied up in the injunction, that starting over required relief from the outstanding financial obligations. Sandra waited until the attorney finished. Then she stood and set a single-tab document in front of the judge with the practiced economy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," she said, "the debt in question was not incurred through failed business judgment. It was incurred through documented financial fraud. My client has provided forensic accounting records demonstrating that $48,000 of LLC capital was deliberately misclassified and redirected for personal use. That is not a business loss. That is fraud. And under Section 523 of the United States Bankruptcy Code, debt obtained through fraud is explicitly accepted from discharge." The judge looked at the document. He looked at Marcus. He asked 2 clarifying questions. Sandra answered both of them without hesitation. Marcus's attorney leaned over and said something quietly to his client. Marcus shook his head, the small, unbelieving shake of a person who has been told something they cannot yet accommodate. The judge did not take long. He confirmed that the primary debt was non-dischargeable under the fraud exception, ordered a structured repayment schedule drawn against Marcus's future earnings, and granted the divorce decree in favor of the petitioning party. He was brief and impersonal about it, the way judges are when the paperwork is in order, and the outcome is legally inevitable. Marcus stared at the table in front of him when the gavel came down. He did not look at me. I did not wait for him to. I walked out of the courthouse and stood on the front steps in the April sunlight and called my mother, who had known something was wrong for much longer than I had admitted, and had said nothing and waited. I told her it was done. She said she was glad. We made plans for dinner. 1 year later, I stood inside the front door of a restaurant on Germantown's primary dining corridor and felt nothing but the particular satisfaction of a room that is working exactly the way it is supposed to. The space had been reimagined entirely. The Edison bulbs were still there because they worked, but the framed farmland prints were gone, replaced by a rotating gallery of work from local artists, a different collection every 8 weeks. The marble bar remained because I had paid for it, and it was beautiful. The open kitchen pass-through now looked into a space that was regularly rented out to culinary entrepreneurs, pop-up chefs, catering operations, food truck owners who needed a licensed commercial kitchen without the overhead of a full brick-and-mortar lease. I had converted the private dining room into a teaching kitchen that ran weekend workshops for women who wanted to learn food business fundamentals, recipe costing, health code compliance, catering licensing, supplier contracts. The restaurant itself operated 4 nights a week, under the direction of a chef I had recruited from a James Beard-nominated kitchen in Memphis, a woman in her early 40s who ran her team with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years earning authority in an industry that had not always offered it freely. Our reservation waitlist was running 6 weeks out. The venture partners, who had walked out of the grand opening that night, had reached out to Sandra's office 8 weeks after the injunction was lifted. They wanted to discuss the new management structure. We had a meeting. It went well. I was reviewing the quarterly revenue summary at the host stand one Thursday evening when my phone buzzed with an automated banking notification. I looked at the screen. A scheduled transfer had cleared into my holding company's account, Marcus's first structured repayment deposit, deducted directly from his hotel restaurant paycheck according to the court's repayment order. I looked at the notification for a moment. Then I put my phone away and went back to the summary, because the numbers on the page in front of me were more interesting than the ones on the screen. His mother had sold her house in the end, not because the equipment lease had immediately overwhelmed her, but because the full picture of her son's finances had made her own position untenable in ways she had not foreseen when she agreed to co-sign a document she had not entirely read. She was living in a smaller place now, closer to a sister she had not spent time with in years. I had heard from a mutual acquaintance that she had joined a Thursday morning book club there. I hoped it was a good one. Amber had retained her own attorney and negotiated a settlement related to the car. I did not follow the details. What I had built in that space was not what Marcus had planned to build, but it was better. Not because of spite. Spite is exhausting and expensive, but because I had spent 14 months funding someone else's vision, and in the process had learned, with the particular clarity that comes from watching your own investment mismanaged, exactly what I would do differently. I would run a space that generated real returns, not just the appearance of them. I would hire people based on competence and give them room to work. I would read every page of every document before I signed anything, including page 11. The most important lesson I had learned inside the wreckage of that marriage was not about love or trust, or the specific risks of mixing personal finances with business capital, though all of those things were real and worth understanding. The most important lesson was simpler than any of them. You do not protect yourself by refusing to invest. You protect yourself by making sure that when you invest, your name is on the right documents. I had signed checks for 14 months. Then I had read the paperwork and understood what the checks actually bought me. That understanding, not the confrontation, not the courtroom, not the garnishment order, was the moment everything changed. The chef came out of the kitchen to discuss the fall menu with me, just as the first reservation of the evening arrived at the door. I closed the revenue summary and set it aside, and turned toward the room that I had built, finally, on my own terms. "Thank you for being here tonight," I said to the couple walking in. "We are glad to have you." And I meant it entirely.